For 200 years, Boston tried to remain an island. This narrow strip of land was the only way in, a filter for the undesirables. At the entrance, you didn't find hotels, you found guards, and a gallows for those who didn't fit the Puritan ideal. The city was a fortress of faith and of control. By the mid-19th century, the ocean that once protected Boston had changed. It had become a conveyor of despair. The Great Famine in Ireland drove millions to the sea. It was a demographic tsunami. For these people, Boston was not the city upon a hill. It was their last chance to survive. The newcomers outnumbered those who had lived here for centuries. The city faced a choice: expand or suffocate. We begin our journey in a place that was once a true gold mine, Boston Harbor. Look at this historic pier in Boston, Massachusetts. Every day, thousands of wooden crates filled with fish were loaded onto ships. They sailed to Europe and to the West Indies. It was built in the 18th century and once stretched from State Street nearly half a mile into the harbour. You can almost smell the sea, salt and seaweed. Here we see the oldest surviving structure on the pier, the building known today as the Chart House. It still serves seafood, and that's not just a modern tradition, it's an echo of what happened here for centuries. But how did shellfish become part of Boston's story? The problem was the harbour itself. At low tide, the water pulled far back. The seabed was exposed, covered with mussels, oysters and other shellfish that locals gathered for food. But with it came a harsh smell. It spread through the entire city. And most importantly, ships couldn't reach the shore. They ran aground in the shallows. Goods had to be moved by smaller boats, trip after trip. That's why this pier was built so long. Long Wharf stretched nearly half a mile into the harbour, out to deeper water, where ships could dock even at the lowest tide. And from here, Boston began to change. From a small port town into a city that chose not to adapt to nature, but to reshape it. We leave the harbour behind and move higher, to a place where Boston's elite decided to play God. 3 massive hills were rising into the sky, and the city chose to erase them. In the early 19th century, Boston was trapped, geographically. 3 hills, Beacon Hill, Pemberton, and Mount Vernon, took up too much valuable space. The elite wanted luxury, but not the labour that came with it, so they found a solution, brilliant and brutal. Boston engineers built one of the first gravity rail systems in America. Wagons loaded with earth and stone rolled downhill under their own weight, dumping millions of tons into the surrounding marshes. The city didn't expand outward, it buried the ocean. But who held the shovels? The same Irish immigrants, who had just arrived on coffin ships. While the elite watched from their windows, their wealth rising, thousands of men dug into solid granite for almost nothing. This was brutal labour. 14 hours a day, in dust, breaking down entire hills. Today we walk these narrow streets, but beneath it, millions of tons of broken hills and the labour of people who were never meant to belong here. We come down from the hills into the green heart of the city, Boston Common. Today it's a park, a symbol of freedom and rest, but its grass remembers more. By the 1800s, Boston Common was already a public space, a place for walks. But do you know how the name Boston even began? For that, we have to go back. At first, this land was pasture. Cows roamed freely. Then limits were set. 70 head only. Eventually, grazing was banned altogether. The first owner of this land was an English clergyman, William Blackstone. He arrived with a group to New England, but when they returned to England, he stayed behind, alone. He lived here for 5 years, on the hill, becoming a friend to a local leader, John Johnson, a minister and a key figure in the early community. In 1630, Johnson saw something remarkable here, a natural spring, fresh water. On September the 7th, he invited settlers to come, to build a new community, and he gave it a name, Boston, after his hometown in Lincolnshire, where he had come from with his wife. Right across from the park, at the top of Beacon Hill, the Massachusetts State House, an architectural statement by Charles Bulfinch, a design that became a model for Capitol buildings across America. Its famous dome didn't always shine like this. At first, it was wood, then it was covered in copper. Only in the late 19th century was it covered in gold. 23 carats, a statement of Boston's ambition, of its place in the world, and even this symbol of power wasn't untouchable. During World War II, the dome was painted black to hide it from enemy aircraft. Today, it's more than a government building, it's a beacon, linking revolution with modern ambition. In the middle of 1800s, Boston made a move that would change everyday life forever. Imagine a city where sewer systems were a luxury, where a toilet inside your home was almost unimaginable, and yet it happened here. The first hotel in the world, with indoor plumbing, opened in Boston, behind heavy mahogany doors, something no one had seen before. A private water closet, with running water, hidden from the outside world, reserved for a few. But this was only the beginning. In the 1850s, Boston laid the intellectual foundation of a nation by creating its first great free public library, inspired by European palaces, but with one radical difference. It belonged to everyone. The city did something unthinkable. It let people take books home. The elite was certain the poor would destroy them or never return them. But Boston took the risk and proved one thing: an educated citizen is the strongest investment in the future. But Boston's greatest breakthrough didn't happen on its streets. It happened in silence. October 1846, Massachusetts General Hospital, the Ether Dome. Before this, surgery was brutal. Pain was inevitable. Then one man stepped forward, William Thomas Morton. He took a simple idea, a sponge soaked in ether, and transformed it into a glass inhaler. He pours the ether. The patient inhales. For the first time, the pain disappears. A man with a tumour beneath his jaw falls asleep. The operation is completed. He feels nothing. Boston falls silent. Medicine gains control over pain. Doctors can think, work with precision. Surgery becomes an art, and suffering begins to fade into history. We leave the scholars' offices, step onto a broad tree-lined avenue, Back Bay. Statues of American heroes stand in shadow. But beneath our feet lie millions of tons of someone else's despair. It began with a mistake. In 1814, Boston's dam blocked the tides. The ocean could no longer cleanse the city. The bay became a giant sewer. By 1857, Boston fought back. Trains carrying gravel from distant quarries poured it into the bay day and night. Architects dreamed of France. They created clean, grand streets. But there was a hidden purpose. Back Bay became a fortress for the elite. Irish immigrants moved mountains to build it, yet they could never enter. Today, prestige stands above their toil, a monument to both ambition and exclusion. We return to the heart of old Boston, to walls that remember the first cries for independence, Faneuil Hall. Since 1742, it has been the cradle of liberty. Here, Boston's revolutionaries honed their rhetoric that would topple the British Empire. But Boston is full of contradictions. This symbol of democracy was built by Peter Faneuil, a merchant whose wealth grew from transatlantic slavery. The loudest speeches for freedom echoed in a hall, created with profits from human bondage. Today, Faneuil Hall is more than a monument. It reminds us how complex and conflicted the foundation of this nation truly was. Boston was never just a city. From the gallows on the Common to the subway tunnels and the first hotels with indoor toilets, the city proved something. The world is exactly as we imagine it. The only question is what price we are willing to pay for our imagination.